Welcome to Why Marx. This evening we have with us Yassamine Matha, who writes for The Weekly Worker and also is on the editorial board of the Marxist journal Critique. The title of this week's session is Debating the USSR and Popular Fronts. So Yassamine will explain as we begin. So Yassamine, over to you, comrade.
Thank you very much, Ian. I just want to explain that there are many titles about this subject, the issues I will cover, but on the whole, there is a point in having, under certain circumstances, and especially in the 20th century, anti-imperialist fronts. What I'm arguing against are the popular fronts and the Soviet strategy, which led to a number of other proposals, including the British Road to Socialism, which I'm no expert of. I'm sure there are people here who know a lot more about it than I do, but I will briefly mention that as well. But I also want to talk about what the Soviet Union proposed, for example, in terms of Iran in 1979 and the consequences of what was discussed. I think it's very relevant because I'm not sure how many of you are film buffs, but a couple of weeks ago, Jafar Panahi, an Iranian film director, won the Palme d'Or Award in the Cannes Film Festival. As far as I can tell, the film wasn't that great. One of the reasons he won it was because there is political dimensions to this, and fair enough. And he's an innocent guy, no claim to be a political pundit, but in his acceptance speech, he made a comment which then was picked up by quite a lot of the left, the Iranian left. And that's where I want to start, not because this talk is about the Iranian left, but I want to start there because in many ways it demonstrates the tragedies that can follow from uniting with everyone, irrespective of what their position is. So what he said was, why don't all the people who defend human rights and democracy in Iran unite? You have to unite in order to overthrow the Islamic Republic. I have no qualms about a film director who is quite an innocent political figure making such a statement. However, very surprising number of so-called radical left that I expected more from, jumped on the bandwagon. What a great idea, right? Now, the one thing I would need to remind these people is, well, it's not such a great idea. The reason we are suffering under the Islamic Republic of Iran, almost 45 years after it came to power, is precisely because we thought uniting with Muslims, Islamic fundamentalists, against the Shah was a good idea. The Soviet Union told sections of the Iranian left that was the only solution. That's what they did. They actually attacked those of the left who opposed them. And the consequences were not a very pleasant 40 years, okay? To put it very, very mildly. So to repeat that mistake in 2025 would be a disaster for the left. Uniting on the basis of human rights. What is human rights these days in the era of genocide in Gaza, in the era of forced starvation on the people of Palestine? So it's a bit odd to come up with such comments. So my main subject is the popular fronts. And these popular fronts basically are in the 1930s. Towards the end, I will refer to the British Road to Socialism, which I always found rather comical. But that's towards the end. And in between, I want to refer to popular fronts in France, in Spain, and what the Soviet Union did in the 1940s in terms of dissolution. This is almost unbelievable when you think of it. Dissolution of an existing left-wing communist party for the sake of a popular front, a mass alliance, which became TUDE. So first, let us start with the Seventh Congress of the Comintern in 1935. This was Stalin's leadership. It certainly marked a major strategic shift in political stance. There were good reasons, or at least one can explain why it happened, but the way it happened was quite dramatic U-turns for many of the existing communist parties. So confronted by fascist advances in Europe, especially after 1933, the USSR promoted the formation of broad anti-fascist coalitions. This contrasted with previous denunciations of what it called social fascists. It called social democrats social fascists. And between 28 and 35, in 1928 and 1935, the Comintern, again under the strong influence of Stalin and the Soviet leadership, rejected cooperation with reformist social democratic parties and promoted a strict stance on confrontation between the working class and the bourgeoisie. There were false assumptions here, because one of the false assumptions was that the capitalist system was going to collapse soon, and direct revolution rather than compromise was possible. Realities didn't match the vision of this period, where sometimes propaganda became fact for sections of the USSR. The policy also encouraged a very centralized authority in Moscow, and that was very much Stalin's view, which really looked at conditions, at directives as given by Stalin, as opposed to, if you like, looking at local conditions. Local conditions weren't important. USSR was the first socialist country. Capitalist system was collapsing, so you could, you went on an all-out war for revolution. But by 1935, all this had changed. Now, here I want to emphasize this concept of people giving very radical slogans like Stalin did, not that it meant much, but giving slogans, and then doing a complete U-turn because realities showed them to be in a completely different position, and therefore suddenly you change your position. So here, given the rise of Nazism, fascism in Europe, the Soviet Union was promoting anti-fascist unity. And the Popular Front approach was the approach of seeking new allies, seeking security. It had three main components, as far as I can tell, in terms of what the party was, the Comintern was saying. Class truce, so revolutionary agitation. The directive was softened the agitation, abandon some of such agitations in order to get allies amongst reformists and nationalists, stagism. And here it's important to argue that this stagism had very clear positions. It was in a colonial setting, arguing for national democratic stage, which should be, according to the Comintern at that stage, being led by bourgeois forces, only to be followed by a not very clear, but maybe distant socialist revolution. And the tactical moderation was communism. Communists should enter into bourgeois coalitions. They should adjust their slogans to match the rhetoric rather than seek radical solutions. So we have examples of this. I think the main ones that I want to refer to is in France and in Spain. In an article in Weekly Worker, I've also made some comments about the Chinese United Front, although I have to emphasize that the Chinese one was very different from France and Spain, partly because, as far as I can tell from various writings, although the Chinese claimed they were following what Stalin said, in practice they went their own way. It's a slightly different attitude towards that, so we shouldn't confuse all of them. For the purposes of this talk, I want to talk about Spain, where Stalinists crushed revolutionary workers such as POUM and anarchists in the name of anti-fascism. In the colonial context, such as India, Vietnam, communists deferred to national parties and very often watered down their program. I don't want to underestimate the fact that these popular fronts in the 1930s were not influenced by the fact that there was a great rise of fascism. However, we do see this idea of popular front strategy appearing again. And this is partly because those who argue that, for example, Trump is a fascist, and there is extreme right-wing semi-fascist views in many of Trump's positions, or that the rise of fascism in Europe is very serious, also advocate such non-class-based popular fronts. And I think that's why the issue is not just historic, but has relevance for today. So in France, we had a popular front is it possible for the admins to stop text blocking my view? I'm trying not to see text and it's very hard. Can I stop it? Okay, I think I've managed to move it to the side so it doesn't keep coming in front of me. So in France, we had the far right riots of 1934. This was part of the Stavisky affair. The French leftists definitely feared fascist takeover. The French Communist Party, the PCF, previously committed to the class against class policy, which had been dictated by Stalin, moved to a popular front strategy after 1935. So it allied itself with the Socialist Party, SFIO, the Radical Party, the center-left liberals. It won elections in 1936, making Léon Blum the prime minister at the time. The Popular Front government did pass some reforms: 40-hour working week, vacations, salaries for vacations, and collective bargaining. But the reality was that the economic pressures, especially the flight of capital and inflation, issues that we shouldn't underestimate. I know some comrades like to forget about such issues. And political divisions weakened this popular front. So the Blum government fell in 1937. It wasn't just because of opposition from conservatives, business elites, and the Senate. It was partly also because the radicals didn't believe in it. So Leon Blum's government, 36-37, did face significant criticism from some of its former allies. The French Communist Party hadn't joined the actual government. Now, this was presumably the Comintern's decision. The conditional support that it had for Blum turned into criticism. The PCF had offered electoral support, but wasn't in the cabinet. So rank and file members and sections of the PCF leadership became quite frustrated by what was going on as Leon Blum's policies became clear. And this was partly because, contrary to what he had claimed, Blum had no intention of challenging capitalist structures, no surprise there. There was no nationalization of bank or major industries. He was sticking to a Republican legal framework, and that limited what he could do. And I think the PCF was more worried about losing its own supporters rather than worried about the consequences of these policies. But whatever, it started some form of criticism. From exile, Trotsky became a fierce opponent. He wrote a number of articles, one of which is Whither France, 1934 to 36, denouncing the Popular Front as a dangerous exercise in class collaborations that disarmed the working class. He argued that the alliance subordinated workers to the bourgeoisie, and he also complained about Blum's refusal to give the proletariat any weapons to fight fascist threats. And he advocated, he was in favor of revolutionary factory occupations and mass strikes. And according to Trotsky, in his writings at the time, Blum squandered a very historic chance for socialist revolution, what Trotsky saw as the only way to defeat fascism and capitalism. There were other critiques of Blum's government. The CGT, SR, viewed the government as a betrayal of working class autonomy. They didn't like this institutionalization of class struggle, and they argued that union energy was diverted into parliamentary politics. Also, they acknowledged some of the basic reforms that Blum had achieved. They argued that replacement of radical self-management of factories that had been occupied with bureaucratic trade unions and bureaucrats from the state completely diluted the purpose of such occupations. Within the socialist ranks, within Blum's own party, there was also criticism They mainly addressed issues such as retreats from nationalization, which was definitely under pressure from capitalism, the policy of non-intervention in the Spanish Civil War, and that was very serious because this was abandoning international solidarity and reliance on bourgeois organizations with no genuine commitment to socialism. So the Popular Front collapsed. For most people, it looked like Blum was only interested in legal reforms within the capitalist system. He didn't want any revolutionary transformation. And as a result, especially after the massive June strikes of 1936, where these were moments where a revolutionary moment could have been perceived, the Blum government's negotiations and acceptance of concessions basically prevented any dramatic change, never mind revolutionary. But I think one issue that was very important was the non-intervention in Spain, which was seen and condemned as a betrayal of anti-fascist solidarity. And in some ways, if this whole Popular Front policy was supposed to defeat fascism, then one way where one could have won it was to intervene in Spain, and Blum was completely not interested in that. The other Popular Front that one has to look at is the Popular Front and Civil War of 36-39. Again, the Popular Front coalition included socialist, communist, Republicans, left regionalists. And they achieved the electoral victory in Spain in 1936. This obviously created panic amongst fascist conservatives, the military. And Spain's left was, in some ways, from what I can read, I can only rely on what I've seen in various articles, was more radicalized probably than France. It had a powerful anarchist group, and it also had the Revolutionary Socialist, POUM, currents. In July of 1936, Franco initiated a nationalist rebellion. And this basically was the start of the Civil War. The Republican government, supported by the Popular Front, did confront Franco's forces. They were being backed by Nazi Germany. And there is no doubt that at this stage, the USSR did supply military aid in terms of international brigades, weapons, and so on. However, it also called for significant influence in the policymaking of the Popular Front, and the Communist Party of Spain promoted a moderate stance to, as part of Stalin's line, which at that stage was to gain support from Western democracies. And at that stage, the main worry of Stalin was that he might lose allies amongst Western governments if it called for social revolutions. So we have, after Franco's intervention and the start of the Civil War, a spontaneous revolutionary surge. We have workers, peasants collectivizing factories, agricultural land, and the militias of the workers supplanted the army, and the dual power was seen in many areas. But the official Communist Party of Spain and the Soviet Union were actually aiming at dismantling some of these achievements. They talked of unity, they talked of the goal of a bourgeois democratic republic, and this inevitably led to many left-wing criticisms. The core accusations centered on the subordination of revolution to bourgeois democracy, justified by the front as essential for winning the war. Again, not just Trotsky, but POUM's Andres Nin argued that this alliance constrained the working class and indefinitely deferred social transformation. The government reinstated capitalist property relations and reimposed Republican state authority over revolutionary bodies, including workers' committees and militia, rather than empowering the masses. Soviet aid came with strings attached, so boosting Communist Party influence and suppressing revolutionary more radical left-wing revolution forces was part of the package. The Communist Party of Spain depicted the revolution as a dangerous diversion from the anti-fascist struggle. So they ordered the dissolution of workers' collectives, they absorbed independent militia into a centralized army, and persecuted anarchists, anti-Stalinist POUM. And in May 1937, Stalinist forces actually attacked the revolutionary workers during Barcelona's May Day celebrations, crushing the revolution's, one of the revolution's most radical phases. The repression of POUM, including the murder of Nim by Soviet agents and Spanish Communist Party, were based on fabricated charges that he was a Trotskyist and he was organizing a sabotage. From what I can read, and again, I can only rely on what is there, in fact, he wasn't a Trotskyist. So the accusations were false. Even then, of course, it depended what he said, not titles and labels. All of this is based in, not in internationalism, obviously, but in real politics. So the idea was that revolution in Spain was a diplomatic liability, and to stabilize the situation, the radical left had to be suppressed. So in some ways, there was a clear preference for a liberal bourgeois democracy in Spain over a socialist revolution, which not only might incite Western intervention, and also revolutions elsewhere because of the nature of the international brigade, but also it would be a government that might not be controlled by the USSR. The anarchists, who were initially a very important part of the revolution because they were involved in collectivization, did later compromise by joining the Popular Front government. And this was probably a major mistake. The Spanish working class had forged revolutionary conditions and structures. So the Popular Front immobilized them. When you look at the various critiques, the left council communists rejected any bourgeois alliances as opportunist. They considered the Popular Frontism as a retreat from proletarian internationalism. council communists, people like Panikok and Gosha, saw USSR as state capitalist at that stage, and argued that the USSR was prioritizing national interests over revolution. I think decades later, Maoist anti-revisionists endorsed united fronts under proletarian leadership in what they claimed to be distinct from the Stalinist class compromise, but condemned the USSR for betraying working class struggles. And here, the emphasis should be that Maoists did argue whether this was practically possible or not, depended on the conditions, but they did argue that united fronts would only work if they were under proletarian leadership. So there is a distinction between that demand and the demand for basically giving up all class politics. Western Marxists, Althusser, Marcuse, Anderson, all have criticized in decades later the Soviet Popular Front strategy as both a statist policy and a depoliticizing policy, because it reduced socialism to national developments and supporting reactionary regimes under, I think, what I would call anti-fascist cover. And later, Popular Fronts became, or some of them changed nature. I started by talking about Jafar Panahi. So I want here, because immediately after the 1930s, we are in the early 1940s, I want to talk about the dissolution of the existing Communist Party of Iran and its replacement by a mass party. And again, I think that is the same idea in terms of the Soviet Union always had a very difficult relationship with the Communist Party of Iran, very close to its borders. This started even under Lenin's time. The original arguments were that the support for the first socialist state did imply restrictions on the Communist Party of its southern border. And there are various arguments for that and against that. This is during Lenin's time, 1918, I think, is the first of those arguments. But the origins of this party, which was founded in the 1920s, but existed in 1917, I think 1905 to 1917, were that they were inspired by the Russian Revolution. The actual Communist Party was an alliance of smaller groups that came together, and it was outlawed by the then Shah, 1930s. And people were imprisoned or driven underground. However, this party still existed, be it underground. And in fact, it maintained some connections with the Comintern. But by early 1940s, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. This was during the Second World War. It's not, I think it wasn't simply that some people have argued that he had Nazi sympathies. I think he was more of an opportunist who saw the existence of Germany as a way to get out of Britain's full domination of himself and his government, because they had put him to power. So as a result of this, the British and the Soviets were in a coalition, and the idea was, the main issue was to get rid of this ally of Germany in a crucial part of the Middle East where weapons could not be sent to the Soviet Union as easily as they wanted because of a Shah that had close relations with the Nazis. So they basically unceremoniously removed him from power. But the Soviet Union went further, so they dismantled the existing Communist Party. And instead, they worked for the formation of something which became the Tude Party, Hezb Tude, which still exists. Now, the term Tude means mass, reflecting the ideas that this is no longer a communist party. It's not a revolutionary vanguard, but it actually encouraged and got support from reformist, nationalist, intellectuals, what the Soviet Union called people who were open to progressive change. And of course, this led to the, if you like, the start of what I would call a patriotic democratic union, United Front, which was supported by the Soviet Union from 1941 till 1980, whenever, 89, definitely in 1979. And of course, it did, because of its papers, because of its work, was consistently advocating united class positions. Now, one of those positions that became quite important was the United Front Against Dictatorship. And the United Front Against Dictatorship included all sorts of forces. By at some stage, it included the National Front. At other stages, because of Soviet policy, not because of what they thought was right or wrong, they opposed nationalist forces, such as Mossadegh's government. This had to do with Soviet ambitions about oil rights in the Caspian Sea. So it was a very vacillating position. It opposed regional and national minorities when it was in the interests of the Soviet Union, yet defended them in 1945 when the Soviet Union, without the knowledge of Tude, its own party, established two republics within the territory of Iran in the manner of East European democratic parties, where basically there was no mass movement. It was an implant of Kurdistan and Azerbaijan republics. There were people who were sympathetic. There were nationalists who were sympathetic to the establishment of these republics, but there wasn't a, if you like, any mass movement from below. So you then see vacillations on this. You also see the Soviet Union changing its positions about the Shah at various stages, because is he opposed to, at various times during his rule, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the ex-Shah, actually did try and get into alliances or economic and trade deals with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. During those periods, then the Popular Front 2 days told you have to support the non-capitalist road to development as pursued by His Majesty. Then as soon as there is a changing policy, that is reversed and they're told, no, you now have to oppose him. these really cost the left any, if you like, credibility amongst radical young students who then looked at alternatives such as PECAR, such as Bedouin guerrillas and so on. So in many ways, this Popular Front policy, this if you like, abolition of a class party for the sake of a Popular Front, which was Tudeh, created many problems. Now, did anyone learn any lessons from it? No, because in 1979, Tudeh supported the Islamic government. It supported it until 1983, where, believe it or not, a KGB spy gave some information about them to various ex-spy, gave some information about them to Western governments. The Islamic Republic was given that information, and they were all arrested, and they faced the kind of repression that they had actually welcomed against the radical left. So the sad story of this kind of politics is really nothing to be positive about. Right at the end, I will also talk very briefly, only because it's in the title, and the title covers such a wide area that I've only glimpsed at various sides of each of these subjects. But I think it's worth looking at the British road to socialism as well. It was declared as a policy by the British Communist Party of Great Britain in 1951. And it was, in some ways, a continuation of this institutionalization of the Popular Front in Western Europe. This was part of the post-war Soviet line of peaceful coexistence, and it promoted a vision of socialism which had only one mean, and that was the parliamentary mean. There's nothing wrong with pursuing parliamentary roads for advancing the revolution, but this had just one road. A democratic coalition government which would be led by Labour and Communists and would legislate a transition to socialism. So left communists, anti-revisionist, Trotskyists, various people have long, and the provisional PCC of the CPGB have long attacked this for a number of reasons. First of all, there is the illusion in Parliament. I think the Corbyn period showed how the British state is not neutral about such issues, and that institutions that have decades of strength in and designed to defend imperialist interests do intervene and do not allow even a reformist, very soft Corbyn, never mind radical left-wing policies. The British road also called for alliances with trade union bureaucrats, Labour leadership. It inevitably would have led to a watered-down program and strategic retreat, which was seen clearly in the post-1945 government, but also later on in the Corbyn era. The national road is also a fallacy because it ignores Britain's central role in imperialism and as an ally of the US as the hegemon power of the imperialist system. It also fetishizes not just trade unionism, but the, if you like, belief in the capabilities of trade union leadership, bureaucrats within the trade unions. It has strong elements of economism in it, mainly because quite a lot of the program deals with better wages rather than overthrow of the capitalist system. There is no revolutionary strategy in the British Road for Socialism. There's no even claims that at any stage the capitalist class will be expropriated, or that the working class would establish its own power through councils, soviets, other forms of government. So basically, it's a legalistic reform proposal within a capitalist framework, which has shown defeats time and time again. So in this very fast-moving global view, I've tried to talk about policies that were put forward by the USSR, both on the Popular Front or parliamentary banners that have led in successive defeats. And it's important to remember them because in the desperate situation of the current world events, there are people who say, oh, well, at least it was better to have that than what we have now. The reality is that those defeats have paved the way for the terrible situation we are in. So we can't just say, we should not tolerate nostalgia for that period of the working class subordinating its demands to bourgeois forces, to capitalist forces. Many revolution movements have been defeated, have been destroyed because of these policies, or they have become, whether they know it or not, gradually become reformist. And others had often argued, the left had always argued, Maoist, Trotskyist, council communist, left communist, had warned that such alliances will serve the interests of bourgeois forces and imperialist powers, and they were right to warn us about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. That was a brilliant excursus through that whole kind of period, which is sort of resonates even today with, as you say, with Trump and whatever else is going on. Of course, comrades, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function and I'll bring you in. The other aspect about it, of course, was the way in which different groups were differentiated on the basis of their characterization of the nature of the Soviet Union, and often without any real scientific understanding, certainly not using a Marxist perspective to try and understand what the nature of by a Marxist method to really understand what the nature of the Soviet Union was, as opposed to what it said it was or what Trotsky had said it was decades before or whatever else. So you've got a kind of a ossified understanding of the nature of the Soviet Union, and that seems to have had a huge impact upon people's attitudes, both to what the Soviet Union said and did, but its actions with relation to so-called national liberation movements and so on. Tobias, comrade, over to you. You'll need to unmute yourself there, comrade.
Okay. Can you hear us now?
Yep.
Okay. I didn't think you'd call me so early. There are a number of things that sort of came into my head while Yasmin was talking. Look, I can't, say anything particularly useful about Iran. It would be very arrogant of me if I tried to. Look, with France in 36, I mean, the Bloom government, I don't think would have ever come to power without those factory occupations. I mean, it was a massive thing, not just mass strikes, but of factory occupations. I think it's significant that Torres told them to stop. He said, "You've got to know when to end a strike," or something like that. I'm sorry, I haven't got the exact quote, but I mean, it's not just Bloom. And in a way, I'm not saying Bloom was marvelous, but he was quite heroic in his way. I mean, during the Second World War, they put him on trial, and he fought his corner. You know, the right put him on trial. Vichy people, I think. But then obviously the Spanish thing, May 37, in Barcelona, it strikes me as a key thing of the nature of Stalinism. The killing of Nin, the slaughter of the POUM, and of those anarchists who did fight. I mean, the Friends of Durruti, I think they were called. I mean, there were some anarchists who the CNT had compromised, but the some anarchists did fight along with the POUM in that episode. And I think the crushing of Barcelona helped Franco win the war. I think it demoralized the Republican forces. And of course, in Spain as well, I'm not sure whether you said this or not, but the Socialist Party, part of it, not all of it, but part of it, was to the left of the Spanish communists. I think it's Larga Caballero. The communists didn't like him. They thought he was too left-wing. I mean, they allied later with another guy who was on the right of the Socialist Party. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name offhand. So to turn briefly to the post-Second World War period, I mean, this strategy is adopted in the sort of 44, 45 through to 47 by Western European communist parties. The point is that the right, the Americans and the domestic right, expel them from the coalitions which they'd been in, but they were in governmental coalitions up till 47 in Italy, France, Belgium. I can't remember where else, but they were. And in terms of that stuff about the mass party in Tudor, a comparison. I'm not saying anything. I got no knowledge of Tudor other than what they did in the end in 79, 83. But sorry, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say about the Togliatti under Stalin's instructions. Really, one talks about creating a new party. The Italian communists who'd remained inside Italy underground still had the idea that they were a revolutionary party, and the idea was to overthrow capitalism. And Togliatti comes back, and with Asfalto di Salerno, he tells them they're not supposed to do that. But I mean, they still don't necessarily believe him. I mean, the final thing is on that, the July 48, when a right winger attempts to assassinate Togliatti. And there's a reaction by the working class, by the communist base. There's a rise up. And Secchia, who was one of the party leaders, but is absolutely loyal to Stalin, thinks at that point, oh, Stalin, let us have the revolution. And he sends his brother to the Soviet embassy and gets told no. But I mean, there is an attempt in July 48 in parts of North and Central Italy at a revolutionary uprising. Togliatti doesn't want it. I mean, the last thing he says before losing consciousness, I can't remember the exact words, but first calm down or something like that. So that there was this contrast between the people who'd remained inside Italy, as distinct from being in the Soviet Union, who thought something was going to come. And also, I think some of the younger people in the resistance, the communists who joined in the resistance and were involved in the armed struggle against the fascists, assumed that there was going to be a revolution afterwards, instead of which they told no. And I mean, you've got you know, to a lesser extent, you've got a similar kind of thing in France. One last point, maybe slightly at a tangent. I sort of felt you were possibly a bit soft on the Maoists. I mean, look, I may have been slightly influenced when I was very young, but I mean, 1971 and China's attitude to the JVP uprising in Sri Lanka and China's betrayal of the Maoists of Bengal, it seemed to me that there was no longer a belief on the part of the Chinese themselves in any revolution. We think it's obvious before Nixon actually visited China that they've completely abandoned that. Okay, I'll leave it at that. There probably is something I was going to say that I've forgotten, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tobias. Will I take some more? Yasmin, yeah? Matthew, please.
Okay. Thanks, comrades. Thanks, Yasmin, for that presentation. It was really, really useful. And I think the point is to look at Stalinism as being this counter-revolutionary force, which undoubtedly it is, and actually it's manoeuvring. And the problem being, of course, is you have to understand the contradictions that give it life. I mean, obviously it's a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, but it sits and is based upon the effort to the overthrow of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Otherwise, I mean, it wouldn't have a base. And it's precisely that it's able to capture that, and that it's able to actually then effectively behead the left for a whole period that we get to this point without that ability to take that the products of that revolution. And the thing is that actually, of course, the Russian Revolution, of course, does enormous damage to capitalism, the continued function of capitalism. No question. You can see, the actual the level of concession that capitalists make after the Russian Revolution is quite exceptional, and continues. That process, and that the fundamental nature of that actually, of course, what the importance of the Russian Revolution today is what it does is it says to the capitalists, look, you lot can be replaced. You are not, you're not invulnerable, you're not necessary, and the rest of it. And that still remains, whether or not, whatever state the thing is. And the capitalist class itself understands that. The more thoughtful bits of the capitalist class, and obviously, finance capital is quite strategic in its view of the world. And so, they do think in that nature, and you can see it. But you can go through all the different betrayals. I mean, obviously, as the comrades have said, I mean, particularly, I think, really, particularly after the Second World War. I mean, obviously the Spanish question, but after the Second World War, I mean, there's a real question. Is there going to be, this mass uprising against capitalism itself? And this is what the Americans are terrified in France, that they don't have enough. They can't put enough, to fight both the Nazis and the French working class. Should the French working class seek to rise up, and it's the Stalinists that do that job, and under conditions. And the comrade previously, Toby was talking about, the demonstration in 1948 when Togliatti's facing his assassination. Those demonstrations were armed. The point was the resistance had not disarmed, the partisans had not disarmed at the end of the Second World War. The workers actually, got the guns that they had out, and the demonstrations were armed. It wasn't a case of, we just go on strike, right? Okay, we'll actually get all the guns we have left from the movement of the partisans out and march. And it's then, of course, it's actually. The importance is, of course, of the Communist Party then once again betraying that, And you can see this also in terms of the countries they take over, you know, after in Eastern and Central Europe, in which, I mean, the point being, of course, is that, you know, when the Red Army marches into these countries, of course, there is an uprising across the whole, you know, many bits of the, you know, the more working class areas, you know, across the whole area. But of course, the Stalinists actually re-establish capitalism. In some cases, drag out capitalist politicians out from their hidey holes so they can form coalitions with them. You know, in other cases, like in Yugoslavia, they actually have to import them because they've all fled. And it's only in 1947 do they, you know, once they've actually managed to stop, you know, any form of uprising or working class driven process, do they actually stage a social overturn and change the nature of those states under their own control? You know, which is a process that's been gone through. In Vietnam, of course, it's even worse because obviously, you know, in Vietnam, of course, with the collapse of Japan, effectively that's it. And it is Stalin who instructs the Vietnamese Communist Party to allow the British actually to land, you know, and re-establish French rule. You know, it's an extraordinary process, and you know, obviously the first act of the Vietnamese Communist Party is to slaughter the Vietnamese Trotskyists, which they do, and then they allow the British to land, and then they complain, of course, when there's a war, you know, between you know the Viet Minh and the British, which goes on for another 30 years. Which is, I mean, yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, the sort of the service that has been rendered by the Stalinists to the capitalists is you know, it's immeasurable in those terms. It's a prolongation of capitalism to the mess that we have now. And the question is then, okay, well, you know, how do we get out of this, and how do you know, and the enormous damage that has done to the workers' movement and the banner of socialism by the behavior of these organizations, you know, which is deliberate. And how do we actually, first of all, understand it, and secondly, recover from it? Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Do you want to answer that now, Yasmin, or take another?
I'll wait.
And over to you. You'll need to unmute yourself, comrade.
I think I'm there, yes.
Yep.
Okay. You know, I've been to quite a few of these meetings, and you know, most of them really, really frustrating, to tell you the truth. But surprisingly, Yassamine, is that your name, Yassamine? Sorry, hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly. Surprisingly, I agreed with the vast bulk of what you said. I cannot recall anything that you said that I didn't agree with. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to, you know, watch it again, and maybe I will pick something up. But you know, I can, you know, from where I am now at this moment in time, I agreed with it all, and I'm quite surprised that you actually said what you said. You know, I really am. And you know, I would say that, you know, plenty of people who are watching, and I think quite a few who have critiqued me in the past, and quite a few have, you know, told me off for my, you know, my Marxist dogma and all the rest of it. I think they will have been quite surprised with what you said, and I'm simply going to say that, you know, every you know, I think the problem is that so many people want to abandon proletarian, well, Marxist theory and you know, proletarian autonomy for the sake of a quick fix. I think that's a problem. You know, the quick fix, the quick solution, the immediate solution, where there are no immediate solutions, where we have to patiently swim against the tide. I am going to say that, you know, a lot of what you said, I think, and I think Ian actually said it as well. You know, so, you know, good on you, Ian. You know, I think, you know, at least he mentioned it. I'm not saying that, you know, that he agrees with what I think, but at least he mentioned this. You know, made the link. A lot of what you're saying about, you know, the abandoning proletarian autonomy applies, I think, to you know, all the theory and rhetoric about national liberation and the possibility of countries actually breaking out of the imperialist nexus in the absence of global proletarian revolution. I think what can be said about popular fronts applies to united fronts. I think it's all about, all of them abandon proletarian autonomy and proletarian democracy. I would also say that the whole question of power has to be approached when we're talking about what can the working class support. Well, it can support nothing but its own power. It cannot be represented. So as soon as you abandon the idea of a democracy based on the immediate recall of delegates, then there is no basis for the construction of socialism. So as soon as you are talking in terms of electing some sort of a socialist alliance to put through some far-reaching reforms or whatever, none of that is socialism. Yeah. So socialism starts with the power of the working class, and the power of the working class can only be expressed through proletarian democracy, which means all officials elected and subject to immediate recall. I'm going to say that somebody said that Yassamine made a better Trotskyist case than herself. I can't remember. It was Geraldine. I can't remember. Sorry if I'm offending anybody by not remembering your name. But I don't think there's anything that Yassamine said there that was Trotskyist either. I think Trotskyism hardly critiqued Stalinism. Trotskyism was all about the fronts and the class collaboration, and still is to this day. Trotskyism still believed that the dictatorship of the proletariat stood under Stalin. Matthew, just said some very nice things and some great remarks, but I still think he's unable to accept the reality of what I'm saying, which is very, very simple. You cannot have socialism without proletarian power. Okay, I'm going to stop there. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to that one.
Thank you, Anne. Do you want to take Raphael first, or do you want to come back on that?
I'll have a quicker. I just, well, first of all, on the JVP and Maoist, I don't know, to be honest, Toby. I'll go and have a read, and I'm sure there are many examples of similar betrayals. I wasn't, what I was arguing was that in terms of a definition of popular fronts and anti-imperialist fronts, we have to distinguish between what different groups said. This doesn't mean we necessarily fall into the trap of supporting them, but these distinctions are important, because if you just put them all in one big basket, then we haven't understood the nuanced differences between them. And at times, those nuanced differences are important because they lead you to be on the side of the working class and the revolution, or on the side of a reactionary government. That's all I was trying to argue. And I think once you justify, for example, defending repression or defending attacks on a strike, or defending or claiming that anyone who opposes a reactionary bourgeois government is a spy because they're not part of your popular front or your idea of supporting the Soviet Union, then you are crossing the line. You're crossing the line between revolution and counter-revolution. And unfortunately, it has never been as simple as saying Trotskyists did this, Maoists did this, pro-Soviets did this. There are many examples where Trotskyists have made similar mistakes. Whether it was their organization or their international's mistakes, that's a different situation. but supporting reactionary government hasn't been just because of USSR and its definition of what it considers to be the duty of the international working class to defend the first socialist state at whatever cost, which was their position for decades. That was their position. And so you didn't use your own brain. You just did that because you were defending. Now, the fact that this state was no longer socialist was a different matter. It depended on your analysis. As far as they were concerned, that was the analysis. That really meant disastrous policies, and we are living with the consequences of those. I think there is an element of truth in the claim that people not only then, but now seek quick fixes. So the quick fix is that it's very difficult to have a proletarian revolution. It's very difficult to have a genuine revolutionary movement. Let's find a quick way. And the quick way is whatever is happening at that time. So, okay, in terms of the example I know best, Iran, here they are. The clergy is demonstrating. This is not just the Iranian left who made that mistake. I mean, quite a lot of the left supported the Morsi movement in Egypt. And it wasn't simply that they were they were reactionaries to support that. They were confused, and this confusion was, there's nothing else happening, so let's support the Muslim Brotherhood. Nothing is happening in Iran, let's support Khomeini. A number of prominent Trotskyists went to Iran and shouted Allahu Akbar and came back and gave talks in support of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the complication is this idea of lack of belief in the working class and wanting quick fixes. Now, you could argue that, okay, well, if you don't have these quick fixes, nothing ever happens. I would argue that quite a lot of the defeats, quite a lot of the, if you like, lack of support for revolutionary left-wing ideas nowadays do have their basis in the mistakes of all of this left. Whether we were part of it or not, we are getting blamed for it. And that is a problem because we are getting the after effects of that. And I think very often the main issue is the level of class collaborations that actually justifies repression, justifies attacks on the working class, justifies breaking up a strike or uniting with fascists, or not fascists in the case of some of the countries I said, maybe the fight was against fascists, but supporting others who are in favor of repression of the working class. So it's a complicated story. And in many ways, I take Toby's point maybe about I'm not conversed in the details of the Bloom government. I looked up a lot of stuff for this talk, and it looks to me as if the kind of politics that the PCF has followed after Bloom is not very different. It had, I mean, there was a joke in sections of the left that when it rained in Moscow, Georges Marchais would take an umbrella in Paris. And there's elements of truth in that, that you're so directed towards politics in Moscow. This was the idea that, it didn't matter the conditions in your country. what mattered was what was in the interest of the Soviet Union, because that dictated, that showed where was the line between revolution and counter-revolution. Those who supported reactionary governments from Saddam Hussein in Iraq at times, Nasser in Egypt at times, most of these, the arguments that they put forward was in the battle between the socialist camp and the imperialist camp, the socialist camp being led by Moscow and the imperialist camp, country X, including Saddam's Iraq, or before that, I can't remember his name, but the previous Ba'athist leader was more favored by the Soviet Union, that Iraq had moved closer to the Soviet framework, and therefore it was more progressive than the alternative, and so one should support it. This was eventually going to lead to the non-capitalist road to development. You didn't need revolutions necessarily. The non-capitalist road to development would mean that the country X or Y would achieve a trajectory, God knows how, but a trajectory, especially with Saddam and the Shah of Iran. It was really, it would then lead to socialism. And well, here we are. We know what happened to all of those countries that followed the non-capitalist road to development with Soviet policy support.
Thank you, Conrad. Raphael, please, over to you.
Hello. Thank you, Yasmin, for the interesting talk and for everyone's contributions so far. I'd like to bring up sort of a, rather than talking about specific historical examples or bring up more historical examples of popular fronts and their consequences, I'd like to sort of prod at the justifications of the Popular Front, because I think, most of us here can identify in the Popular Front the loss of the political autonomy of the working class. We can say subordination to Moscow, the dampening of revolutionary rhetoric, and that all comes with dangers that have been acknowledged so far. So we can look at the experience of the Popular Front in France and see how, that ultimately failed and it demobilized the French working class and disillusioned PCF members. But given that the rationale of the Comintern for instituting the Popular Front policy was the threat of fascism, and that the rationale for the Popular Front is therefore anti-fascism, sort of the test of those principles and the belief in opposition to the Popular Front is whether you are opposed to anti-fascism as a political principle, or what you consider anti-fascism to be. So I've seen in the chat that though we criticize the Communist Party of Spain's positions in the Spanish Civil War, which were obviously aligned with the bourgeois republic. The orders from Moscow were as such, and they followed them quite thoroughly. In the starting months of the Spanish Civil War, much as the Bolsheviks after the February Revolution exploded in membership, but the membership wasn't working class membership. The PCE was flooded with middle class, petty proprietors, business owners, government officials who, in the chaos of the Civil War and Revolution, clearly saw their class interest and which party was advancing it. And it wasn't the liberal Republican Izquierda Republicana, and it wasn't the PSOE, it was the Spanish Communist Party. But nonetheless, I saw in chat people saying, well, of course, you still have to support the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. You still have to fight for them, so you still have to be in the Popular Front. So that raises the question of, well, what kind of participation in the Popular Front is the proper communist position, which maintains class independence, and which is the traitorous class collaborationist Stalinist position? And I think that, this is a difficult question to answer. It's one I struggle with myself. And this, of course, is then mirrored in your approach to the Second World War, where I would say that most communists, including anti-Stalinist communists, nonetheless have an attitude of, well, of course you have to fight the Nazis, of course you have to support the Soviet Union, and you have to support the Allies. The rationale that Trotsky gave was that workers in bourgeois democratic countries that were fighting against the Nazis were not fighting to preserve bourgeois democracy, but to preserve the seed of socialism that exists in bourgeois democracies that would be, retarded by fascism. But if we acknowledge that popular fronts and these sorts of coalitions with liberals, seem to always end, or almost always end, in a defeat for the working class, in getting stabbed in the back, in the revolutionary working class forces exhausting themselves in the fight against fascism only for the bourgeoisie to sweep in and reassert themselves. What is the correct course there? The Communist Party of Spain acquired quite a number of high ministerial offices during the Spanish Civil War. The government of Juan Negrin was pretty much entirely staffed by communists. Their control after the dispersal of the Trotskyists and anarchists was pretty much complete. And nonetheless, in the last months of the war, they were couped by the Republican military seeking better terms with Franco. I don't think there's any situation in the Spanish Civil War where social revolution isn't fully carried out and you don't actually defeat the bourgeoisie on the Republican side and turn the Civil War into a revolutionary war. That doesn't end with, a Republican victory that just ends in a bourgeois victory, which I do think is what Stalin intended. I don't think there was for a moment Stalin didn't intend for the Spanish Civil War, even with a victory of the Republican side, to end with the Communist Party of Spain actually taking power in full so as not to scare France and Britain and the United States. But yeah, I thought I'd just bring that up and sort of see what kind of what other people's thoughts on that are, because I think the question of whether it is correct for communists to really have an anti-fascist perspective at all, and not to simply focus on fighting the bourgeoisie in all its forms, or whether we do consider fascism to be this sort of trans-historical, unique evil that needs to be combated at all costs, including the loss of the political independence of the working class. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. As always, a very thoughtful contribution. Question raised in the chat. I agree with your theory, Yassamine, which, though further complicates gaining freedom from oppression for the masses, will bring truer freedom and ultimately socialism. There will be a change from capitalism, which I think Marx was correct in. It's just what type of change will that be? Yassamine, over to you.
Okay, I think Raphael comments are important, and I don't want to underestimate or underestimate the threat of fascism, the fact that it could have ended up even worse than what it ended up. The questions one has to ask is, was the Soviet Union ready to accept socialism in Spain if it wasn't in control of that socialism? And my guess is they didn't. They didn't want left communists. They didn't want POUMs. They didn't want Trotskyists. They didn't want non-PCE, which was under their direct control to achieve socialism. Was this the most important point of view as far as the Comintern was concerned, the directives? I don't know. But on the other hand, I'm not underestimating the fight against fascism. The problem is that once you start attacking strikes and collectives, workers' collectives, peasant collectives, you are actually helping fascism. So the battle is very different then. you can't simply then say, we are still fighting fascism. You're defeating fascists' most courageous and most radical opponents. So no, you're not doing that. I think in terms of the third world, the pro-Soviet parties, the pro-USSR parties, became a different kind of organization in that people who wanted, especially in the global south, people who wanted progress in their country, but did feel opposed to colonialism and imperialism, joined these organizations. They could have joined another party as technocrats, as people who wanted advancement in capitalism, technological progress, this kind of thing. And that in itself changed the character of of these parties, these organizations. So they became fundamentally reformists. They wanted to build capitalism with a human face. It wasn't simply even what the Soviet Union was saying. They had become part of the establishment, and that establishment wanted a different kind of capitalist development. So the complication was that, okay, they opposed, and very often they weren't even called Popular Fronts or anti-fascist fronts. They were called anti-dictatorial alliances, anti-dictatorial fronts. And the Soviet Union was very keen on these types of fronts. The problem is the dictator then became their friend, and the anti-dictatorial alliance collapsed. So it really was very difficult to follow what one could do. But the nature of these parties, I think, did change, and they did become part of the existing order, whether they liked it or not. At times, they might have been repressed as well, but in some countries, such as Iraq, they were allies of the Ba'ath Party, then enemies of the Ba'ath Party. They were suppressed, then they weren't suppressed. They were part of the coalition, then they weren't. But at all times, they were no longer part of a revolutionary movement. They were somewhere else, if you like. And I think that really makes the difference. The problem with, obviously, if you see a threat like fascism, like we do see it now, there is no doubt. There are aspects of this that we see. It's not just Trump, it's in Eastern Europe, in Putin, in various forms of extreme right organizations. The simple, quick answer is, well, let's unite with anyone who opposes Trump, right? Then are we going to unite with Nancy Pelosi and Biden in the US, with Macron in France, with Carney in Canada? So then you have to think, where is this going to lead? And I think there is now more of a reluctance to go through that kind of, not that Trump is exactly like Hitler or fascism is the same. There are major differences. But all I'm trying to say is that building anti-fascist fronts is seductive, is easy to do. The example I gave of Jafar Panahi and his anti-dictatorial front that he's talking about, well, the most financially, if you like, powerful opposition group to the Islamic Republic of Iran are royalists paid by Zionists. So we form an anti-dictatorial front, as the Tudeh party is telling, the ex-USS Pro USSR party is now telling us. We form a dictatorial front with opponents of the Islamic Republic. Are we going to include the pro-Zionist royalists? Is Mr. Panahi who's arguing this? And those sections of the Iranian left, including Rah Kargar, Communist Party of Iran, who are now supporting Panahi's call for unity. Are they defending this? They don't even know what they're talking about. So it's easy to say we want to form anti-fascist, we want to defeat fascism, but defeat fascism with what weapons, with what kind of alliances, with what kind of politics? And here I think the balance of forces do matter as well. So if you are a weak, or if the left is weak, if the left has no mass base, getting into any of these alliances would be a complete mistake, because you'll be swamped. You won't stand a chance. If the left is powerful and can dictate its line, then it is in an easier position to tell the other forces and force them to accept its forces. But the reality is in none of the cases that I mentioned, the pro-Soviet Communist Party had any intention of asserting its political line. Whether it had one or not, I doubt it, but it definitely didn't want to assert its line.
Thank you, Yassamine. Comrades, in the absence of any other questions or contributions, I'd like to thank Yassamine for what I believe is an excellent presentation, and also has a lot to teach us about the present. And the one thing that Marxists have going for them is our ideas. So it might seem like we're not strong on the ground, but we can at least understand the situation in which we live far, far better than the bourgeoisie can. Okay, comrades, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you.
Thanks very much.